Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world. And welcome to this learning experience brought to you by Kentik. My name is Cody, and I'd love to welcome you back to Techstrong Learning. We have an exciting panel ahead, but before we get things kicked off, we do have just a couple of housekeeping notes I'd like to review. First, today's session is being recorded. So if you miss any of our discussion, perhaps you'd like to rewatch or maybe share with a friend, the on-demand recording will be made available shortly after we conclude this live session today. If you'd like to engage with us, there are a couple of options for you to do so. The first of which is the chat tab, which some of you have already found. We'd like you to start warming that section up for us by letting us know from where in the world you are joining us. Now, if you have any specific questions, we would like you to direct those to the Q&A tab. Sending your questions into that Q&A tab helps us keep track and helps us be sure to get to your questions in a timely manner today. Also, if you click the handouts tab, you'll see there are a copy of the slides available for you to download. So feel free to grab those if you'd like to read along or maybe jump ahead just a little bit. Of course, before we close things out, we will be giving away 4 $25 Amazon gift cards, so be sure to stick around for the duration of our conversation today. So our topic today is putting the network in observability. And I'm joined today by a panel, but we will be moderated by Mike Rothman, Chief Strategy Officer at Techstrong Group and GM at Techstrong Research. Mike Rothman, I'll turn it over to you and let you introduce the rest of our panel.
Great. Thank you, Cody. As always, doing a wonderful job of figuring out and helping everybody understand where the chat is and the Q&A. And amongst other things, I really shouldn't give Cody that much of a hard time. He really does anchor a lot of our learning experience episodes and webinars that we do. So thanks, Cody, for that. Welcome, everybody, to Putting the Network in Observability. As Cody introduced me, I'm Mike Rothman, GM of Techstrong Research. And I recently worked with my pals at Kentik at doing a whole bunch of analysis in terms of really getting a sense of where folks thought the network fit into a lot of their monitoring and observability aspects of that. What are they trying to do? What kind of outcomes are they really trying to achieve from analyzing network telemetry? So we will have data today, and data is very exciting. But before we get into our data, let me introduce our panelists because, again, very pleased to be able to work with just a great group of folks from Kentik. So why don't we kind of go around the horn a little bit? Rosalind, Whitley, why don't you introduce yourself? Tell us a little bit about your background and what you do for Kentik, kind of most of the time when you're, not, doing other stuff.
When I'm not doing this, when I'm not on this call. Thank you very much, Mike. Yeah, I'm Rosalind Whitley. I work at Kentik. And who am I? I used to be an operator. I was a sysadmin a long time ago. I've worked as a developer. I've worked as a solutions engineer for customer success and education, and somehow ended up working in marketing. And now I work on product marketing at Kentik, figuring out how people, why people need network observability and how they're using it to do their jobs. So, yeah. And I need to turn off my Slack notification.
Oh, you look great, Roz. So that's, what people are, hitting you up on Slack for that standpoint. So we're also joined by Phil Gervasi. So Phil, why don't you give us a sense of what you are about, what you do?
Sure. Good morning, everybody. My name is Phil Gervasi. I'm the Director of Technical Evangelism for Kentik, which a lot of folks have no idea what that means. Frankly, I sometimes have no idea what that means. So but I was, like Rosalind, an operator on the network side for 15 or 18 years. And then I was a generalist before that. And I was in education before that. So I was a traditional network engineer, installing routers and switches and taking down data centers accidentally. A lot of wireless and getting into emerging technology. Now, for the last 3 years, I've been laser focused on network observability, which I think we're going to discuss is at least what I believe to be the evolution of network visibility. And we'll get into that, right? And what I do today for Kentik is I go around and, I'll tell you, I'll be very frank with your audience. The primary reason I'm in technical marketing is so I don't have to do cutovers at 2 a.m. on a Saturday anymore. So I don't do that. I work banker's hours. But to be real, I have a background in education. I love to talk to people and connect with our customers and with the technical community at large. And so that's what I do now. engineer to engineer conversations in local user groups, in webinars such as this, and blog posts and training videos, and whatever I can do to help folks understand what we're doing at Kentik.
That's awesome. And just, give you a little sense of my background. I have a similar background to Phil, although I was never really formally in education. I started out as a network, kind of admin and configurator and those kinds of things. So really a programmer. And then I kind of saw the light and realized that networking was where it was. And then I kind of got, basically pulled into security about 30 years ago. So I've been doing network security in that kind of ilk, and a lot of monitoring and observability types of requirements as well for a long time. So what we have here are a bunch of folks who have been there, done that, all have operational experience, and really can hopefully provide some context to, kind of both some of the survey data and really to help you understand why network telemetry is really important as we continue to move down this cloud path. We continue to move down, kind of this DevOps path. Obviously, DevOps.com is kind of our host for today. But it really is an important, concept to really think about, right? Because, back in the good old days, Phil, you remember this, if there was something wrong, you would typically check the physical layer, right? You just go around, and depending on how old you are, I would actually have to, crawl around the floor and make sure nobody kicked over, kind of the thick net junctions on that front. But I'm maybe a little bit older than a lot of the other folks here. But again, we would typically just look and make sure that we didn't have a connectivity problem before we started thinking about whether it was an application issue or server issue or something along those lines. Now, because everything is a clickety-click within an interface, really, focused on, again, a lot of cloud and DevOps application orientation, we really don't, kind of pay enough attention to the network layer, right? And it's just kind of there. And part of the reason we like clouds or this whole virtualization of the network side. But I can tell you that networks continue to be pretty important in terms of making sure that we not only can provide the application support and services that we need, but that we can also figure out what's happening within the health of the application and really help to really troubleshoot and make sure that we've got the proper performance and resilience for those types of environments. So what we did with our pals at Kentik was surveyed a whole mess of you folks. So we ended up with well over 500 responses. We asked a whole bunch of different questions to get at really why folks are thinking about network observability. What is it that they need, and what are the top use cases? So let me show you that. It's a little bit of an eye chart. There's a lot of numbers here. We asked, along the lines of 10 or 12 different statements about your specific networking environment. And really, when we thought about and trying to break down the issues, they came into view and visibility, and a couple of them really floated to the top. Right, we need to find efficiencies to reduce network administration overhead. That was the one between strongly and agree. Really kind of had the highest numbers, right? So we need to find efficiencies to reduce network administration overhead. I don't know, guys, when you're talking to customers, do we have too many network administrators out there? Are they doing the wrong stuff? Let's see if we can get some context around why folks would feel that this was really a big challenge as we move towards a lot of these virtualized and cloud-based networking infrastructures.
Mike, I'm going to focus on the two that you circled there in red, but I'm also going to harken back to what you said in your introduction. I think you understated the importance of the network, right? We're only just starting to, it's always there. Yeah, it's kind of like plumbing in my house. I don't care that much about the plumbing. I care about the water that comes out of the faucet. That's what's important to washing the dishes and doing the things that we do. But my goodness, when that plumbing doesn't work, then it's all over. We're in crisis mode, P1. And so we have this dichotomous relationship with, networking today, where we are, on one hand, we don't think about it, we don't care about it, we care about it's the substrate, the mechanism that gets us to where we want to go. But that's the thing. So think about how we use applications today. I'm sitting here talking to you on a webinar, and I have 0 local applications open on my computer, and I'm not lying, I promise. 80%, 90% of the application, I'm making this number up, but it's a lot. Most of the applications I use are delivered over the network. Office 365, Google Docs, Zoom, many, Salesforce, Dropbox for Teams, whatever you are using is usually delivered over a network. So if you think about it, the network is more critical than ever to just doing the mundane daily stuff, and also the mission critical. I've worked with healthcare, I've worked with government, I've worked with energy, nuclear, right? So that's pretty mission critical. And it also implies that there is a tremendous amount of application performance data, telemetry, embedded in the network itself. So now we're not necessarily an APM company over at Kentik, but we recognize that, my goodness, if you want to know why your application stinks, why is it slow? Why is this not loading properly? Why can't I do? You can look in the network and often find the answer there. Whereas in yesteryear, all you cared about was like your desktop and then the server in the in the MDF or the IDF down the hall, and then connectivity, like you said, right? Check the plugs, check the power on things. That's not the case today. Now we can gather telemetry from everywhere, but therein lies another problem. Think about where that traffic is going. It's going everywhere. It's going up and out into a CASB, into one cloud for the front end, and then on the back end, maybe it's reaching to a database on another cloud, a different cloud provider, and who knows what else. There's network overlays if you're an SD-WAN user, or maybe sharing with on-premises resources, and there's a VXLAN overlay. So you have all this complexity, and it's all falling on the shoulders of network operators, network administrators. In fact, many of the cloud engineers that I speak with used to be network engineers just 2-3 years ago, right? And here they are transitioning. And so when I look at the second box in particular, our network monitoring tools don't provide end-to-end visibility. Well, no kidding, because here we are with all of this new telemetry that we need in the past 3 years, 4 years, 5 years. So we're all rushing to figure out, how do we see what's going on? How do we identify what's going on in the networks that I don't own, considering that we rely completely on the public internet, right? How do I get the visibility between my resources in Azure and AWS and them talking to each other? I don't know. And so here we are. One of the things that we do at Kentik is provide that visibility. Some of it is inferred, so there's a confidence level, and some of it requires telemetry that we've never gathered before, more than just flow and SNMP, although those are very important. Well, we'll talk about that, but we're going to need to add to that. And so that's where we are today, is we are developing those tools to meet the demands of how we consume applications today.
Yeah. I think that you talked about it falling on the shoulders of network engineers and network operators. And I think I have never been a network operator or a network engineer, but I have been an application operator and an infrastructure operator. And I've worked with a lot of those folks as they do go on some of these transformation journeys, or maybe they're already transformed into a more service-oriented architecture. And I think like the problems remain the same. I remember myself like investigating an issue that turned out to be a network issue and using some pretty rudimentary tools to do that, and kind of being the only one. And a lot of times I remember it was, a problem would come up and it was kind of a head scratcher, and it'd be like, well, let's just throw more resources at that problem because we don't really want to understand the root cause. And I was always the one obsessed with trying to find the root cause to a fault and not wanting to throw more resources at it. But when it's a networking issue, sometimes throwing more resources at the problem doesn't solve it, and then it's going to come back later. And I think, I remember using some really crude tools to do that, packet sniffing and things like that, and really not knowing much about how to use them, which I think part of our job at Kentik is also just educating people about what can come up and what they should be looking at. But now, fast forward into the future, working with these folks who are working with operating workloads that are coming from many, many different developers, many different development teams, complicated stacks, different types of infrastructure being used together, different services working together, shared services that are connecting to multiple applications. Like, there are going to be network problems that come up. And I still think the question is, like, a lot of people have is, how do I even find that out? What tools can give me insight into that? And so I find myself having that conversation more than I expect.
Yeah, you bet. And I would,
Sorry.
No, I think I also want to provide a little bit more of a historical backdrop as well, right? Because it really hits on both the optimization challenge as well as the visibility challenge. And that was back in the day, right? We had private networks, which meant we had to provision all of those different connections, and we would use things like frame relay and kind of a number of other, kind of connectivity services, and private T1s or what have you. I'm pulling out the old memory archive from that standpoint, but those were things that were in our control. They were dedicated to our specific environment. We knew what was happening with those. Now, less so, right? And it's not just, Phil, you mentioned a whole bunch of, different cloud-based services that we're using, but let's also look at it from the user perspective too. If we're talking about internal applications, we have remote employees everywhere. And we were moving in that direction anyway. Obviously, 3 years ago, we had a little bit of an issue where we had to be remote for a long time. And now we're kind of in the middle of this environment where folks are trying to figure out, are they remote? Are they back in the office? The answer is probably both. So our traffic dynamics are much less deterministic because we don't know where folks are going to be on any given day, right? We've got our application environments. Those are much less deterministic as well. Again, Phil, you talked about some of the different architectural constructs we have. We have data services that are in a lot of cases in a different place from application services. And again, old folks will remember that is, hey, that kind of looks like a 3-tier architecture, except in a 3-tier architecture, we controlled all of that stuff. Now in our multi-tier architecture, we've got PaaS services. We've got, kind of specific things. We've got serverless workloads that are happening. And the thing that really kind of makes all of this work together is that connectivity fabric that allows us to communicate amongst all these different areas. So again, it's not just that the challenge is, well, yeah, we've got folks and applications and all that. Yeah, we have that. But each one of those different stacks, each one of those different components is so much more complicated than it was in the past. So in the old days, you could probably get by with a little bit of ping, right? A little bit of trace route and really, kind of really pinpoint, at least what area your issues were. Nowadays, you don't have that option, right? It's way too complicated to think that you're just going to be able to peel this stuff back, which again highlights the importance of much more granular network telemetry that'll give us a sense of, again, what's happening within that environment. Again, that's one piece of the puzzle, obviously, but without that connectivity, nothing else happens from that perspective. So anything else jump out, from the data of this, specific question that we asked them on this one?
So your first bullet there that's not circled is that our network can't keep up with our application's connectivity requirements. Those requirements are out there. And if you think about it, every one of those components that the application touches between you, sitting on a tablet at a coffee shop or at home or in a branch office, whatever, and then those resources that you want to access. Actually recorded a podcast with somebody recently, and I said that the whole point of the network, it's the delivery mechanism for the application. And he corrected me and said, not really. We don't care about the application either. We care about the data that the application helps us to get to. Very interesting perspective. But ultimately, every single one of those components can affect application performance, can affect your end user experience. Every single one of those pieces of the puzzle that you alluded to, which are actual services and components. I don't like it when technologists get into this thing where they say, oh, it's magic and blah, blah, blah. There's no magic. There's Python and there's Cisco CLI and there's workflows and spreadsheets. My goodness, there's still those. And all these tools that we use. And Roz, I have to admit, you mentioned, packet sniffing and Wireshark. I mean, Wireshark. Yeah. As a newly minted CCNA many, many years ago, there was nothing better than, looking at packets in Wireshark on a Friday night. All my friends were going out. That's very interesting and fun. But my goodness, how do you do that as a human being, individual, right? Sitting there in a NOC, trying to do all that. Now, there is an answer. The answer is you could hire an entire team of PhDs from MIT. You could do it. You could do it. You can have people that know all these technologies and how to ingest the various types of data with different data formats, different data types, completely different scales. But I mean, that's kind of ridiculous. So that's what we're seeing with network observability, is being able to encapsulate that workflow, that data analysis workflow, into a platform where it's easily consumed in one spot. And that's what we're trying to do in the industry. So, and maybe, Roz, you can give some color here, but what we're doing really is very operations focused, helping engineers solve problems, be better engineers, ultimately to provide a better end user experience and keep those applications moving.
Yeah. I think there's one question here that I found a bit polarizing in talking to folks. And this one we had mixed results here. So cloud networking has made our networks more complicated. And I think hard to manage. Yeah. Hard to manage. Yeah. And I think, okay, one thing as a marketer now, when I look at that question, one of the things that I will comment on, I just said this to a colleague yesterday, it's like, a lot of our audience maybe doesn't feel comfortable saying that something is like really complicated and really hard to manage. And that's how I am, right? When if someone's like, oh, is this too complicated for you? Is it too hard for you to manage? I'm not going to say yes to that, right? Because I'm smart, right? I can deal with complexity. And that's our job. But I do think it's also polarizing because some organizations are really in this situation and others aren't. So some organizations are in a situation where maybe they've had a bunch of different acquisitions, or they're working with a bunch of different internal organizations who have different types of infrastructure, and there's complexity with that. And at a really large company, it can be the complexity can be very overwhelming, and it's not because of it's too much complexity for any one person to grok, but it's that there's the human element of that too, right? Like the different operators over time who have figured out a way to get something to work, or written a script, or automated something in a way that they understand or their team understands at best. And then that gets kind of calcified over time. And when you multiply that by 10, it's not that we can't handle complexity. It's that, can I say the complexity is maybe feels unnecessary? Mm-hmm. It feels, and it's not like it's complexity that for complexity's sake, but I think complexity happens, and it can be challenging to deal with in any given moment.
Yeah. From the standpoint of having done cloud stuff for the last 13, 14 years, like before it was even like cloud stuff, right? It was, we didn't even have a name for it back then. AWS was kind of just in its infancy at that point. Really what we've seen are kind of two dichotomies happen here, right? The first is, because of that complexity, you have a lot of organizations that try to lock stuff down because it's just too hard. Right? It's just too hard unless you have some level of sanity around, kind of what folks are doing. And shockingly enough, they build something that looks an awful lot like their existing data center network, right? Which you kind of sit there and go, well, okay, you can do that, but it kind of defeats the purpose of the cloud, right? All the flexibility that you have, all the virtualization that you have, all that. And then on the other side of the continuum, you basically have anarchy, where every application team can build the network that they need for the specific application. And again, you don't have any standards. It's really difficult to understand what's actually happening. And from a troubleshooting standpoint, it's virtually impossible, because you do have so many different constructs, so many different architectures, so many different technologies that are in there. So there is somewhere in the middle that's going to be required. But ultimately, again, the more standardization you have, the less complexity you have. You could make the case that does, favorably impact costs. But I would say that, again, part of the advantage of using cloud capabilities is that you do have the ability to build the network that the application needs, as opposed to retrofit the application onto the network that you have. So we have to figure out a way somewhere in the middle to manage all this complexity and really make sure that we can deliver the resilience and the performance that we need. And that's really a long-winded way of, kind of moving towards really the tool chain, right? Or the tool set that we're going to use in order to control a lot of these environments. And shockingly enough, we asked a question about what, specific tools were folks using in order to manage and do their network monitoring and or observability. We had a whole bunch of different options that were here. Really, which technologies floated to the top were really application performance monitoring, now roughly called observability, but we'll use a different context for observability. So we wanted to keep it to APM on this, and a variety of different net flow. So, pulling net flow out of your cloud, pulling net flow out of your on-prem networks, probably pumping it into some analysis package in order to give you some sense of what's happening that is not Wireshark. I'm just kidding, right? That would do packets on that front, right? But again, what do we see, kind of when we look at, kind of the tools that folks have, what they use? Is this just a matter that, folks use the path of least resistance, which is my application folks already have an observability or an APM thing, so I'll just use that? Or my network folks have been able to give me the net flow data, so I'll just take a look at that maybe in my SIM because that's the tool that I have. So again, we look at this thing and what kind of jumps out at you guys?
Well, what jumps out to me is that you need all of these things. This is not an if then either or, in my opinion, in 2023. So the reality is, applications are being delivered over the network. And so, you want to capture flow. Okay, great. From your routers, switches, VPC flow logs. What does Azure call them? Actually, they also call them VPC flow logs, right? Cool. Yeah. GCP system logs. So you're collecting all those net flow and flow-based data types. Great. You're doing some sort of forensics analysis after a breach. Well, you're looking at packets. So, okay, you need that. You're also doing code reviews of the application to see what's going on here, and maybe doing some kind of API monitoring, or looking at how long does this web page take to load, how long does DNS take to respond. All of these things affect the end user experience, application performance. And therein lies my definition for network observability. So some people think it's a marketing term and you roll your eyes. That's fine. I've been there on the engineering side of the presentation where I've rolled my eyes at marketing jargon and marketecture. So you could call it advanced monitoring or next-gen network visibility, whatever you like. But the idea is that we're going beyond collecting more data. But because there is this incredible divergence and diversity of data, we're also now expediting the process of understanding why something happens. So you're looking at all of these things. You're collecting threat feeds and routing tables. I see BGP in there. So it could be internal or your IGPs as well. Container monitoring, look at metrics using maybe eBPF or flow or packets or whatever you're using. All of that comes together in network observability. All of these tools come together in network observability. It's not one or the other. It's not flow-based visibility. It's flow is important. We'll collect it. Let's ingest that. Oh, eBPF? Yes, let's ingest that. And then we can start to identify when something is happening in that end-to-end path. We can start to do cool things like correlate, although I have some strong opinions about that. We can start to do cool things at our data analysis workflow to see patterns and identify that there's a DDoS attack brewing in this region of the world, and maybe we should do something about it. Maybe even programmatic, where it's auto remediation, or anything along those lines. We haven't talked about cost yet. We see a trend in your ingest egress costs in AWS changing over time. We don't know why, but here, because we have all the data, we can see that, wow, for some reason, folks are resolving it, this cluster of DNS servers over here, and is changing the nature of our monthly AWS bill. Isn't that weird how those are related? Never would have seen that, but we have computers, right, that can do that. And so I look at this graph here, this series of what is it called? The bar graph.
Yeah, bar chart. Yeah.
And I say, oh, I want it all. If I'm in a NOC, I want all those things. If I'm in a SOC, a security operations center, I want all those things and more.
I want to flag, we did get a question from participant 154, and I think we're not maybe at the point of answering this yet because we're going to talk about this soon, but we just want you to know that we saw your question. We are definitely going to answer it. And then I guess in terms of tools, yeah, right on, Phil. And also, when I think, and you're talking about, observability is a bit of an eye-rolly term, and I think that's true. And I think when we think about observability, and what I'm hearing in what you're saying too, is that observability is ideally about being more proactive versus reactive. I guess that's how I think about it. But in truth, like calling something observability doesn't make you proactive in itself, right? Like, so it takes other ingredients like organizational maturity and a certain level of infrastructure health, I guess, to be able to be at that point of being proactive. And I mean, I guess really when I think about proactive, I'm thinking about what is it? Google's SRE handbook, and that's telling you about, you know, ideally you're spending no more than 50% of your time on toil, and the rest of the time you're spending on proactive work that's going to reduce cost over time, or it's going to improve performance, or it's going to make it easier over time to reduce that toil and automate things. So you can kind of say the same thing about monitoring versus observability. Ideally, you have the tools in place that allow you to monitor what needs to be monitored in real time and deal with things as they inevitably are going to come up, but that you also have time to do some of those things you're talking about, Phil, which is looking at trends before they turn into something that's exploding or turn into something that's impacting the customer significantly. You notice it first and you decide what to do about it. So when I think about observability, yeah, it's proactive. It's about being proactive, and it's about decision support, kind of.
Yeah. One other kind of layer that I'll add on top of what you just said, Ross, which I think is great, because, you know, again, proactive is where we want to be. If we're sitting there with our fire extinguisher on our back all day, every day, right, we don't really get anything else done. But I'll also kind of layer in the importance of prioritization in terms of any of these other aspects of, again, our day-to-day activity. So if we're able to look at a much broader view of the connectivity fabric of all of the different applications I have in all of the different cloud platforms and on-prem and a lot of these other, you know, types of mechanisms where we're sending data from one place to the other, then we're able to get a sense of what is the most important thing for me to do right now. Because there's a lot of stuff we can do. I don't know about you guys, but my to-do list, there's usually no lack of things that I have to, you know, work through on a daily basis. But what is the most important 1, 2, or 3 things that are going to have the biggest impact on kind of the health of my, well, it would be my workload in that case, but, you know, certainly a corporate operator would be in terms of, you know, again, the stuff that they're doing from a customer facing standpoint, an internal application standpoint. I mean, there are a million ways to kind of slice that up, but without a much broader view of the entirety of your environment, you're just acting tactically. And again, that's a strategy, right? You know, you can certainly just continue to do tactical stuff day in and day out, but again, you know, when you kind of look back 6 months from now and be like, what did I get done over the next 6 months? There'll be a lot of stuff ticked off of your to-do list, but maybe not really the right stuff from your to-do list. So, you know, making sure that you have the ability to prioritize and understand, you know, again, what 4 other things I can eliminate if I just do this one thing, right? You know, that's an important, you know, kind of view on how we do stuff. So we've kind of danced around, you know, kind of the term, right? You know, because obviously everybody kind of gets a sense of what application-oriented observability is. But let's kind of dig in a little bit into, you know, what we'll term as network observability. So let me just read this. This is, you know, kind of a little bit of a holy grail or aspirational idea here, right? Network observability gives you the ability to answer any question about your network quickly and easily across any kind of network, cloud or on-prem, across any network element, right? Physical, virtual, or cloud service, whether isolated at the network level or with application and business context, right? So let's kind of peel that back a little bit, you know, and talk about the nuances or the differences of having to gather telemetry from a physical, you know, on-prem network versus a virtual or cloud-based network and some of the complexities therein. So again, either of you have a specific opinion on that one?
Phil does.
I sure do. I am so glad to see 89.7% of respondents say yes. That means that there's something changing, because only a couple of years ago, when I said the term network observability, I almost got smacked in the mouth, you know? Folks were like, oh my goodness, another marketing term. And now folks are understanding. They're starting to see that, yeah, we need to gather all, you use the term broad. I think I would say exhaustive. Like, we need everything. Everything that the network, or rather everything that an application touches to get to you. We want telemetry from that, because it isn't the IDF down the hall, copper wire, twisted pair, or RF, you know, if you're on wireless, and then, you know, my laptop. It's a lot more than that. And so I'm glad to see that starting to change. So I see this definition, and it reminds me of our CEO's definition from his what is it called? Network Observability for Dummies, right? The ability to answer any question of your network. Why is something happening? That's the question, right? It's not, oh, I see something happening. See, that's not a question. Oh, why is it happening? It's like the difference between just seeing more data and then understanding why something happens. So it's the difference between seeing and understanding, if that makes sense to our audience today. And so, to give you an example from my own history, let's say you have a couple of links in your data center, right? And they're 100 gig links, right? And maybe they're active standby, which is kind of a stupid thing, because you want to load balance and utilize what you have. But let's say they're active standby, and one of them is being consumed regularly and you see it. And the other one is just a dribble at a couple megs a day on a 100 gig link. That's a big pipe. I mean, there's bigger today, right? But I've never configured 400 gig. I got out of engineering by the time those came around. And then all of a sudden you start to see trend upward from 1 meg to 2 megs. That's a statistically significant increase. It's a 100% increase. Do you start firing off alerts? No. It affects the end user experience, the application performance, like nil, zero. It's not doing anything. And so that's the difficulty of where we're going with network observability. It's being able to not just see more stuff, but understand why, and add that subjective human factor into the code, into math, really, which is very difficult. And that's what our data scientists do at Kentik, to be able to identify when something is significant, important. When do we start firing off those alerts? I talk to our data scientists all the time about how we can do that better. Now, let's say that 1 meg goes to 2 megs, but then it goes to 3 megs, and then 4. Still very, very low, but we're starting to see a trend. Well, maybe I throw an alert. And therein lies the difference between traditional, or dare I say legacy, network visibility, and then what we're doing today, modern network observability. We're being able to answer the question, why is this happening? Not just knowing, oh, my BGP adjacency is going up and down, or I have an OSPF adjacency that's flapping. Well, I want to know that. But if you can get me to the why faster, well, that's really what we're doing here in network operations. Fix that problem faster. Now, I remember back in the day getting into networking and really falling in love with the fact that I had a project and a puzzle. And it was fun, like in hindsight. I mean, during that, I'm sweating and hating it, wishing I could change careers immediately. But in hindsight, those were so fun, figuring out what's going on and why this thing was happening. But that's not the CIO's perspective, or the CTO, or the director of it. And they're like, no, fix it now. I'm glad you're having fun. That's great. But fix it now. We have end users complaining. We're losing money. Our e-commerce site's down or slow, and customers are signing off and going somewhere else. Fix it now. So that's where we're going with network observability. Again, across any network element, we've listed a few, and we can probably list more. We haven't gotten into containers really much at all yet, and the microservices architectures that we rely on. We haven't talked about just the public internet in general and how we're relying on name a provider for our mission critical applications, right? Sometimes just last mile, and sometimes we're relying on providers we've never heard of because our applications live across the world. So there's a lot there.
Yeah, I think there's actually a pretty strong link between, Mike, your intro to this, your segue, and what you just said, Phil, and talking about how you use, and it's really in the definition right here, is answer any question. And what sticks out about that to me, and what sticks out about your prioritization comment, Mike, is that these are things that your tool cannot do for you. Like, your tool itself cannot define the unknown question that you need an answer to. And it also cannot, or probably should not, prioritize for you what are the most important things to pay attention to. There are definitely tools that try, and there are definitely tools that can help with that. And Kentik is one of those that can help with, here are the insights that are the most critical or most important to you. But at the end of the day, what I think network observability is for is to help you answer questions and help you make better decisions and get through those problem solving scenarios that are kind of fun faster versus doing it for you. And I think that's the reality of network observability that I respect. I think we are a ways away from, Chat GPT or whatever, being able to do this for us. Like, it cannot make these decisions. It cannot make these decisions quickly and as accurately as you can if you have the right data and it's accessible to you in a way that you can crunch it and you can contextualize it, put it to make those prioritization decisions and understand like the gravity of what you're doing, right?
Yeah. And the key piece of that is the context, right? I kind of call that the C word sometimes because some folks get horrified by that concept. But the reality is, if you don't know what's happening up at the application layer, if you don't understand what the real business drivers are, you can't make a prioritization decision because, again, you're treating something that is very low level as the same as something that is mission critical to your environment. So that business context becomes absolutely paramount in terms of really delivering this. But Ross, you did allude to, kind of the outcomes for what, folks really want out of their observability experience. So we actually asked that question, right? So we asked folks to rank a variety of different, kind of potential outcomes that they would get out of observability. And interestingly enough, it was kind of the ops perspective that kind of prevailed here, right? Identify the root cause of networking issues, pinpoint latency and bottlenecks, before we got to things like detect threats and policy violations. We haven't even, kind of touched on the security and the threat aspect of this yet. So let's table that for a minute or two and really talk about, kind of the ops piece of that. And again, that's just the obvious, hey, if you give me a view of what's happening in my network, that will allow me to, again, troubleshoot more effectively, proactively pinpoint, some of my bottlenecks, make my environment work better. Right. So again, that's a pretty good outcome. I would take that outcome, if it's, hey, here are a variety of outcomes, make my stuff work better tends to be a pretty good outcome. So customers, kind of view that. Is that kind of the primary, driver for why folks really are looking towards, network observability today?
I think that's what we've seen. I think that's what we've seen. And I think our customers it's the number one and number two, again, the AI can help you do a good job with this, but AI can't do it. We still have people out here who are trying to find that latency quickly or recognizing it before it comes up, becomes a problem, and trying to understand those hard problems. So,
yeah. And if you're looking at what we're solving, it's an operations problem.
Yeah.
We did not invent a new routing protocol that converges faster than ISIS or whatever name of protocol. We put together a data-driven network telemetry analysis platform that ingests everything into one place. So you're not opening up 17 different tools, a flow tool, an SNMP tool, an eBPF tool. It's one tool and everything is there, which means we can also find how things are related to each other and then identify the root cause of why your application stinks much faster. Remember we used to, I get an alert, right? A big red on my dashboard. My network is down. And I look at it, I'm like, I already know that. I already know that. Why is it down? That's where we want to get to. And often, well, it's not often. Today I hear it all the time. Latency is the new down, right? Latency is the new outage. Yeah. So it's not just like, I got an alert that the network is down. I got an interface that's hosed or a router that's at 100% CPU and just decided to reboot itself. No, that's just latency. And now I got to figure out what's causing that latency. Do I have an over-provisioned VM? Do I have an overutilized link? There are just so many components. Is there a specific ASN in the public cloud where there's latency because the fiber-seeking backhoe took out, a main trunk line between something in the Midwest US? Who knows? The bottom line is that there are a million different components. And that's why we ingest all of that in order to pinpoint where is that latency. And And when you mention context, what we call it coloring or enrichment at Kentik,
Yeah.
we're looking to collect any kind of information we can and add it into our, we have a unified data repository, a UDR. So it's a unified database of telemetry that drives our platform. And we're going to add it into that because we want to know. We want to know application IDs. We'll collect stuff from your CRM, threat feeds, routing tables, stuff not from your network, so we can fill in those gaps and tie things to business intent, tie things to application activity, tie things to user IDs, whatever it happens to be, and it's different per customer. We'll also even add in cost, because the reality is we are looking at that as well. Now, as a traditional engineer, I was in the last days of my being an implementation engineer and a solutions architect, I talked about SD-WAN a lot. We weren't talking about replacing, customer X's routers. We were talking about SD-WAN deployments. And sometimes the conversation was around saving money on getting rid of MPLS links, right? Because they looked at that as a method to save on their OpEx. But a lot of the time they were locked into those contracts, right? And they were locked in, or it was just so cheap because the providers saw the writing in the wall. So like, yeah, I'm going to keep it. I get sub 1 millisecond latency. Sure, I'll keep it for next to nothing. Why not? Just add it to my list of links on my SD-WAN. But most often, those conversations were conversations about cloud connectivity. How can I connect to my new CASB because I'm not backhauling my traffic back to my data center security stack? How can I more easily connect to these various SaaS providers? Microsoft 365, what they do is they have regional POPs now. So if I'm in New York, right, and I try to connect to my Office 365 apps, I'm being via DNS and whatever else they're using, being redirected to the closest, usually geographically closest point of presence. Well, how do I know what's going on if I'm a network operator and I have users calling and saying, I have, lousy application performance, or I have this going on? Well, you need people to identify all those things. Pinpointing latency bottlenecks often has very little to do with the network that you own and has everything to do with networks that you just kind of get a little bit of telemetry from if you beg them and say nice things and say please to them. And that's where we are. We're solving this operations problem. How do you get there faster when we can't see things like we used to when it's just flows and packets on our own network?
Yeah. And when it comes to cloud, you talked about enrichment. I mean, we're pulling data from AWS APIs, Google Cloud APIs for that enrichment, for cost, business context, application context, security context, all of that, and putting that in there. So that's kind of the added value. It's not just, it is also nice to not have to be clicking through a bunch of different accounts and subscriptions to try to understand a problem. But even if that's not a problem for you, having that enrichment, having that data enrichment with context can make all the difference in allowing you to sort through that.
You bet. And prioritize. But you mentioned the S word. Roz, can't let that one, fly by, right? Security. And again, that's kind of something that's, a little bit near and dear to my heart since I've been, kind of hands-on doing security stuff for a good part of the last 25 years. So, again, being an old networking person, right, kind of with a security background, I certainly have some opinions as to where network analysis and telemetry, and now we'll broaden that to observability, really fit into, kind of the set of capabilities and tools that you bring to really identify security issues earlier, right? And that's the name of the game. Right? If the earlier you can figure out that you have some emerging attack or you have some data that's going to a place that you're not overly familiar with or could possibly be malicious, the earlier you can kind of get on top of that, either block that thing or do something like that. So when you're talking to customers, obviously the ops stuff is paramount for these folks, but to what degree do they really start thinking about security? To what degree do they start saying, we want to move towards this zero trust thing, although I'm not even sure what that means in most cases. How do you do that within the networking, kind of side? And really, how do you leverage the data that you guys collect really on all that context to really help folks understand, hey, we have an issue here. We may have to get the security folks involved.
I'm going to start with the second half there. How does Kentik deal with the data that we collect? Security is important to all of our customers. Some is a top priority because they're in highly regulated industries. So whether we're a SaaS company, and so we're providing our service, our customers are consuming it over the internet, but we do have a few private on-prem deployments as well. But primarily, we're a SaaS company, and folks connect to us over a secure TLS tunnel, and that's how we're ingesting information from their resources. We're collecting information from resources that are not from our customers, but from the public internet and things like that. So. But ultimately, that gets secured in our private cloud, and we're using particular database types that allow us to compartmentalize customers. So that way, there is security around PII and, of course, all that kind of stuff, where we're not necessarily correlating data from one customer to another. I know that some folks do that, and I do understand that there's value there for sure in normalizing patterns and trends and what's going on in the industry. But because, again, our customers and we have those security requirements, that's how we do it internally. Now, keep in mind, and I'm sure, Mike, from your experience, you'd agree that data is the foundation of security. It's the cornerstone. Visibility is the cornerstone of security. What's going on? How did that happen? Being able to investigate, unfortunately, if it's a post-mortem investigation and finding out something weird, like, oh, look, they're piggybacking on port 53, UDP, right? DNS. In order to get into my network, and finding that out and having to look in the packets and figure out, okay, great. So that's all visibility tools. But we have that data that we're ingesting. And so one of the use cases is being able to identify those patterns. We can ingest threat feeds, and these are what different types of botnet virus definitions, all that kind of stuff look like, right? And we can see proactively that there's this kind of activity happening on your network in this region or in the world, right? And we can then say, this is a mitigation that we should kick off programmatically, or we fire off the alert. So that's one use case specific to just securing yourself from those bad actors in the world that are, trying to not necessarily always, it's not always a matter of pure security. Sometimes it's a matter of privacy, right? So there is a difference there. And in either case, we want to protect against that, and it starts with the data.
I'm looking at this question and trying to assess if we have given ample advice on concerns raised about data security and privacy. I think you pretty much covered it, Phil.
No, let's dig in a little bit, because I have a little bit of a different nuance on that one, and that's really the fact that you do have in the payload of your network traffic potentially sensitive data, right? Sometimes it's encrypted, sometimes it's not. So I think really that question, and we hadn't really addressed it to any degree. That question is, what do you do? Are we just looking at header data? Are you analyzing payload stuff? What gets captured? Because that was always the challenge with PCAP, right? It was, well, you've got all my data, which means you can put together a session and access pretty much, what's happening within that application. So what do you guys do to, kind of address that concern with customers?
Yeah, if you have the PCAP, you have everything, and there's value to that, especially if it's your network where you can, you have the session keys, you have the legal ability and the wherewithal to decrypt traffic, to look at what's going on in the fine, that's great. But a lot of the time, you don't have that option, especially when you are running traffic over the public internet. You have SaaS providers, and there's certain parts that you can look into and certain that you don't. Now, what we do is we have found that the vast majority of the information that we need is found in, like you said, headers and in the metadata, and you don't need to, and several of the other fields that you'll see prior to, various different types of tags and things like that, prior to getting down into the payload itself. There's very little information that we need from the payload, except for those, I don't want to call them corner cases. Security is not a corner case, but once you get into the payload, it's a different thing. You're looking at the actual, or rather you're performing an audit or some kind of a forensics analysis after the fact. But we can identify so much of what's going on without crossing that line. Even if we are using, let's say, flow and sampling down to one-to-one, which is pretty resource intensive, but you could sample one packet. Every single packet is another flow record. The amount of information that you're getting from headers and all the different tags and from the metadata and all of that's involved, you're looking at round trip times and how long it takes for a server to respond to a request, is tremendous. Stopping just before being able to perform that security audit, as far as like, they're piggybacking off of this port and finding out what's going on. So as far as privacy, and actual security, like being able to restrict looking at payloads, that's not really an issue with what we're doing at Kentik, which is why we don't claim to be a SIM. But at the same time, the use cases for security are there. And so we do have customers, I mentioned DDoS, so I'll stick with that one. We do have customers that utilize this primarily for DDoS detection and also mitigation as well.
Yeah. And I'm mostly, when I think about security at Kentik, I'm mostly thinking about it from the perspective of Kentik Cloud specifically. Mm-hmm. And I do think that's where we have a bit more proactive capability. And I've seen been talking with customers about this recently. Mike, you made what I hope was a joke about, does anyone know what zero trust security actually is? And I think, but to your point, and I think I've heard a customer say this, which is like, we want zero trust and we're doing zero trust, but like understanding what that actually looks like for a given workload is kind of challenging. And I've talked about these situations where an infrastructure team is working with a bunch of different developers or different development teams, that adds complexity because you don't necessarily know the details of, like, they don't know these infrastructure engineers don't necessarily know all of the workloads like the backs of their hands. Like, they're not thinking about all of the different requirements and also maybe all the ports that communication should be happening on. So what I've seen customers using Kentik Cloud for is to observe, okay, here's a workload. Here's the lowest common denominator of traffic that needs to go into this service in order for it to function normally and for us to have the end customer outcome that we want. And all right, let's set up security groups or other firewall rules that allow us to block every other type of communication. Okay, great. So that's one concrete thing you can do with Kentik because you can see all the traffic coming in and out and understand what you need to allow. But then things change or mistakes happen, right? So what customers will do is they'll look at flows to understand what security rules to put in place. Put those security rules in place, and then you got to keep monitoring it. You got to keep monitoring it to see denied traffic. What's the volume of denied traffic? And when I have denied traffic, does that mean I need to tweak a rule? And another customer I was talking to the other day, they are really want to be cognizant of security rule hygiene too. So if they have a rule that's not being used, not being hit, then they want to know that as well, because if it hasn't been used in 30 days, let's get rid of it. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of where I think, oh gosh, I was about to say, well, I am going to say where the rubber meets the road. But there's some kind of idiom to describe it. That's where zero trust security policy in the cloud can actually happen. You're looking at the flows, understanding the traffic over time and monitoring it and using a tool that will surface those denies for you. Surface those in a dashboard so that you know what to do and you don't have to manually go through and look through every bit of traffic.
Yeah, no, that's great. And I would, again, kind of highlight the fact that it is a dynamic environment, and, any of those policies that you have that are going to restrict access to only authorized parties have to be monitored and updated on an ongoing, if not daily basis from that standpoint. But alas, we're almost out of time, guys. So, again, just guys start talking network shop, and man, the time just starts it flies by. So, from a wrap up or summary standpoint, let's talk a little bit about what are the first 2 or 3 things that folks can do to really get better perspective on what's happening at the network level that they have to deal with. So we'll let each of you go, and then we'll wrap stuff up and let everybody get on with their day.
Sure, I can start. I think when you're planning to, when you're developing your monitoring strategy, right, and you're reevaluating it, it's good to start with the foundation of flow, SNMP, packets, all of those things. They are still very, very, very important. We are not here saying abandon that. Network observability is this new thing and do all these other things. That's not the case. What we're saying is we're building upon that foundation. Flow is actually very important to Kentik, SNMP as well, all of it. And what we're doing then, what you need to do as far as developing your new strategy is looking at where your applications flow, what are they touching, and getting the telemetry from those areas. Now, ultimately, you want to be able to ingest all of that into one tool, so you can actually effectively monitor your application traffic without having to log into 7 different tools. But that's where that's why we have this focus on container network monitoring, cloud monitoring. Now we have developing security use cases, simply because what we're doing at Kentik is saying, what are applications touching to go from where they live to you, wherever you are? Doesn't matter where you are. And that's, again, one of the reasons that we also collect information from the public internet. We have many service provider customers that we're able to glean some information from. And that needs to be, I think, paramount in the strategy moving forward. Where are my applications coming from? Where are they going? And what are those components? Some of them are third party and you don't own them. And that's where a platform like Kentik can help.
Fantastic. Roz, any parting thoughts?
I think, to answer your question, I think the first step for an operator, at least, and that seems to be our audience, is thinking about, just start by thinking about where the network is important in the types of workloads that you're managing, which you may not have thought about. So is pod to pod latency important to you? How does networking show up in your container environment or in your hybrid environment? Start there, and rest assured the tools are out there for you to help you with this, and they're better than they used to be, and they can help save some time when you're dealing with application level issues, to rule things out and understand what's a problem, what isn't, and what your priorities are.
Yeah, that's fantastic. So it wouldn't be a Techstrong learning experience if I didn't hump a couple of updating or upcoming events that we have. So Cloud Native Now is happening July 11th. Data Ops Day is happening August 16th. You can register for those of you that didn't get the slides, which is everybody. You can register for those right on the back end of that. And with that, I want to thank Roz. I want to thank Phil. And I want to hand it back to Cody, because we have some gift cards to give out.
Yay! Thanks, Mike.
Awesome. So we'll just dive right into it, since we are after the hour already. Our 4 winners are Evgeny K, Francisco C, Tyson K, and Joe P. So to our 4 winners, you will be receiving an email with a link to access your gift card. It should make its way to you in the next 48 hours. But if you don't happen to find it, rather, check your spam folder just in case it happens to be filtered out. Also, this session was recorded, so should you want to rewatch, you will be receiving an email with a link to access the on-demand. You can also find it living on the DevOps website at devops.com/webinars, and be sure to look in the on-demand section. I'd like to thank Kentik for sponsoring our program today. And to our audience, if you're still hearing my voice, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate your time, and we do just want to ask for one extra minute. There will be a survey that pops up as soon as we close out, and we would love to hear your thoughts, whether they be about this program we just had, or if you have a suggestion for an upcoming program. We do want to hear what you have to say. Either way, we do hope to see everyone at a future Techstrong Learning Experience. Rosalind, Philip, Mike, thank you all so much. Everyone, you may now disconnect.